Of Vietnam by Ayn Rand. This article was written in May 1975, a few weeks after the fall of South Vietnam to the communists. Because the Ayn Rand letter was behind schedule at the time, the article was published in the issues dated August 26 and September 9, 1974. The televised scenes of South Vietnam's sudden collapse at Da Nang seemed oddly familiar to me. They had a faded, distant quality of déjà vu. The scenes of people in hopeless flight, the panic, the despair, frantic struggle for a foothold on the last plane or ship leaving a doomed land. With everything left behind and nothing ahead, people running into a void outside history, as if squeezed off the face of the earth. I had seen it all before. It took me a moment and a shock of sadness to realize where I had seen it. This was the Russian population fleeing before the advance of the Red Army in the Civil War of November 21st, 1918. The newscaster's voice said that fleeing South Vietnamese soldiers had seized control of an American rescue ship and had proceeded to rob, rape, and murder refugees, their own countrymen. I felt indignation, disgust, disappointment, and again a faint touch of familiarity. The shock was more painful this time, when I realized that this was an example of the ignominious immorality of so-called political right. Let me hasten to say that individual brutes exist in the army and cannot be taken as representative of an entire people, that the atrocities committed by those particular South Vietnamese would not even be reported if and when committed by the North Vietnamese, since such atrocities represent the official ideological policy of North Vietnam, that South Vietnam does not represent the political right or the political anything. Granting all this, it is still true that if a group of soldiers attack their own countrymen in the midst of a national disaster, it means that attackers and victims have no values in common, not even the solidarity of primitive tribalism, that they have nothing to uphold or defend militarily, that they do not know what they are fighting for. And in today's world, there is no one to tell them. I was in my early teens during the Russian Civil War. I live in a small town that changed hands many times. See We the Living. That part of the story is autobiographical. When it was occupied by the White Army, I almost longed for the return of the Red Army and vice versa. There was not much difference between them in practice, but there was in theory. The Red Army stood for totalitarian dictatorship and ruled by terror. The White Army stood for nothing. Nothing. In answer to the monstrous evil they were fighting, the whites found nothing better to proclaim than the dustiest, smelliest bromides of the time. We must fight, they said, for Holy Mother Russia, for faith and tradition. I wondered, even in those years, which is morally worse, evil or the appeasement of evil, the cowardly evasion that leaves an evil unnamed, unanswered, and unchallenged. I was inclined to think that the second is worse, because it makes the first possible. I'm certain of it today, but in the years of my adolescence, I did not know how rare a virtue intellectual integrity, i.e. the non-evasion of reality, actually is. So I kept waiting for some person or group among the whites to come out with a real political manifesto that would explain and proclaim why one must fight against communism and what one might fight for. I knew even then that the what was freedom, individual freedom, and a concept alien to Russia, individual rights. I knew that man is not a slave of the state. I knew that man's right to his own life and therefore to freedom has to be upheld with as great and proud a sense of moral righteousness as any idea could ever deserve. I knew that nothing less would do, and that without such a stand, the anti-Reds were doomed. But I thought that this was self-evident, that the whole civilized world knew it, and that there surely existed some minds able to communicate this knowledge to Russia, which was perishing for lack of it. I waited through the years of the Civil War. Nothing resembling that manifesto was ever uttered by anyone. In a passive, indifferent way, the majority of the Russian people were behind the White Army. They were not for the whites, but merely against the Reds. They feared the Reds' atrocities. I knew that the Reds' deepest atrocity was intellectual, that the thing which had to be fought and defeated was their ideas. But no one answered them. The country's passivity turned to hopeless lethargy as people gave up. The Reds had an incentive, the promise of nationwide looting. They had the leadership and the semi-discipline of a criminal gang. They had an allegedly intellectual program and an allegedly moral justification. The whites had icons. The Reds won. I learned a great deal in the years since. I learned that the concept of individual right is far from self-evident, that most of the world does not grasp it, that the United States grasped it only for a brief historical moment and is now in the process of losing the memory. I learned that the civilized world is being destroyed by its dominant schools of philosophy, by irrationalism, altruism, collectivism, and specifically that altruism is the tear gas that defeats resistance. By reducing men to crying and vomiting. The hardest thing to learn, the most difficult one to believe, was the fact that the so-called political rightists in this country, the alleged defenders of freedom, i.e. of capitalism, were as vague as empty. And as futile as the leaders of the White Army, more shamefully so, since they had a much, much greater knowledge to evade. For years, the intellectual posture of America's political leaders has been a long, pleading, appeasing, self-abasing whine of apology for this country's greatness and apology, addressed to every advocate or perpetrator of collectivism's horrors and failures anywhere on earth. But even American politicians had some sort of stature when compared to their intellectual mentors. Those, to me, still incredible bipeds who, unable to find a moral justification for man's life and happiness, attempted to defend freedom on the grounds of altruism of the public good, or on the grounds of faith in the supernatural, or on the grounds of brushing the issue aside and proclaiming that morality is irrelevant to economics, i.e., to man's life and livelihood. At a certain point in recent years, I realized with astonishment that the kind of voice and manifesto I had been waiting for was my own. No, this is not a boast. It is an admission of a sort I don't like to make, a complaint. I don't like self-beating. I did not want, intend, or expect to be the only philosophical defender of man's rights in the country of man's rights. But if I am. And dear reader, if I am giving you the kind of intellectual ammunition and inspiration I had so desperately waited to hear in my youth, I'm glad. I can say that I know how you feel. No country could stand for long on the kind of moral erosion that the altruists and immoralists of the right had done their best to aid and abet. The war in Vietnam was the result and dramatization of that erosion. The military collapse of South Vietnam was preceded by the philosophical collapse of the United States some decades earlier. It was a shameful war. The reasons which leftists and sundry friends of North Vietnam were proclaiming, but for the exactly opposite reasons. Shameful because it was a war which the U.S. had no selfish reason to fight, because it served no national interest, because we had nothing to gain from it, because the lives and the heroism of thousands of American soldiers and the billions of American wealth were sacrificed in pure compliance with the ethics of altruism, selfishly and senselessly, in compliance with epistemological irrationalism. It was a war and a non-war at the same time. It was a modern monstrosity called an Armenian War, in which the American forces were not permitted to act, but only to react. They were to contain the enemy, but not to beat him. In compliance with modern politics, the war was allegedly intended to save South Vietnam from communism. But the proclaimed purpose of the war was not to protect freedom or individual rights. It was not to establish capitalism or any particular social system. It was to uphold the South Vietnamese right to national self-determination, i.e. the right to vote themselves into any sort of system, including communism, as American propagandists kept proclaiming. The right to vote is a consequence, not a primary cause of a free social system. And its value depends on the constitutional structure implementing and strictly delimiting the voter's power. Unlimited majority rule is an instance of the principle of tyranny. Outside the context of a free society, who would want to die for the right to vote? Yet that is what the American soldiers were asked to die for, not even for their own vote, but to secure that privilege for the South Vietnamese, who had no other rights and no knowledge of rights or freedom. Picking up the liberals' discarded old slogan of World War I days, the self-determination of nations. The American conservatives were trying to hide the American system, capitalism, under some sort of collectivistic cover. And it is not capitalism that most of them were and are advocating. It was a mixed economy. Who would want to die for a mixed economy? In compliance with the Hegelian sort of A is non-A metaphysics, both sides kept contradicting their professed beliefs. Soviet Russia, who regards men as the property and fodder of the state, did not send soldiers to North Vietnam. She could not trust them to fight, so she sent only military supplies. The United States, whose foundation is the supremacy of man's right to life, sent soldiers to die in South Vietnam. Soviet Russia, the philosophical apostle of materialism, won the war in Vietnam by spiritual, i.e. moral, intellectual means. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were thoroughly indoctrinated with the notion of the righteousness of their cause. The United States monolithically scorns materialism and professes to be moved purely spiritual beliefs, mystical, religious on the right, tribalist and anti-industrial on the left, abstained from proclaiming any moral principles or any principles whatever, and relied on an abundance of material supplies to fight the war, an abundance of planes, bombs, and guns in the hands of men who had no idea of why they should use them. The savagely primitive farmers of North Vietnam had an incentive, the promise of looting the richer industrialized South. They had the leadership and the semi-discipline of a criminal gang. They had an allegedly intellectual program, Marxism, and an allegedly moral justification, altruism, the sacrifice of all to some higher cause. The South Vietnamese had nothing but some mixed economy, echoes of the same altruism. The North Vietnamese won. As a rule, there is an ugly period of gloating among the winners and of bitter buck passing among the losers following a war, but I do not know of a historical precedent for the spectacle displayed by American intellectuals, an explosion of gloating over America's defeat, of proclaiming America's weakness, of denouncing America's guilt, of glorifying and glamorizing the enemy, of pelting America with insults, accusations, humiliations, like an orgy of spitting at their own country's face. When a national catastrophe, such as the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, has no generally known reason and no clearly perceivable cause, one may find leads to some contributory causes by observing who profits from the catastrophe. Intellectuals are the profiteers on the Vietnam War. They are of so miserably small a stature that it would be impossible to suspect them of causing the disaster. They are not lions, but jackals. The lion who avenged himself for too long a neglect was philosophy, which left the U.S. vulnerable to the jackals. What are the suspicious the scavenger pack? Observe the double standard switch of the anti-concept of isolationism. The same intellectual groups and even some of the same aging individuals who coined that anti-concept in World War II and used it to denounce any patriotic opponent of America's self-immolation. The same groups who screamed that it was our duty to save the world when the enemy was Germany or Italy or fascism are now rabid isolationists who denounce any U.S. concern with countries fighting for freedom when the enemy is communism and Soviet Russia. The catchphrase of these new isolationists is a shabby little equivocation to the effect that other countries are not ours to lose. We did not lose South Vietnam or China or Hungary or Czechoslovakia because it was not ours to lose, i.e., the fate of other countries is none of our business. This means other countries are not ours to judge, to deal with, to trade with, or to help. Unless it is help with no strings attached, i.e., help without moral judgment, political appraisal, or even humanitarian concern about results, as demanded by Laos when it threw out a U.S. aid agency, but wanted the U.S. money turned over to the Laotian government. The purpose of this new isolationism is to play on the American people's legitimate weariness, confusion, and anger over Vietnam in the hope of making the U.S. government afraid to become involved in another foreign war of any kind. This would paralyze the U.S. in the conduct of any foreign policy not agreeable to Soviet Russia. The first intended victim of the new isolationism will probably be Israel. If the anti-war efforts of the new isolationists succeed, Israel and Taiwan are the two countries that need and deserve us help, not in the name of international altruism, but by reason of actual U.S. national interests in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. To oppose the spread of communism is a worthy goal, but one cannot oppose it in jungle villages by surrendering civilized countries, and one cannot oppose it by hiding from the world the nature and the moral meaning of communism's only opposite and enemy, capitalism. To use America's phony involvement in Vietnam as a scarecrow to keep us away from the real, the essential centers of the fight against communism. This is the current gimmick or policy of the neo-isolationists. Observe the frame-up staged against America's military power. One of the methods used by statists to destroy capitalism consists in establishing controls that tie a given industry hand and foot, making it unable to solve its problems, then declaring that freedom has failed, stronger controls are necessary. A similar frame-up is now being perpetrated against America's military power. It is claimed that the U.S. forces were defeated, had never been allowed to fight. They were defeated, it is claimed, 2 years after their withdrawal from Vietnam. The ignominious collapse of the South Vietnamese when left on their own is being acclaimed as an American military. There is no doubt that America's entire involvement in Vietnam is a failure unworthy of a great power. It is a moral failure, a diplomatic failure, a political failure, a philosophical failure, the failure of American politicians and of their intellectual advisors. But to regard it as a military failure is worse than outrageous when you consider the heroic performance of Americans in a war they should never have had to fight. If there are many or groups who have vested interest in creating an impression of America's military weakness, use your own judgment as to their nature and goals. Now observe the moral bankruptcy of the humanitarians. After decades of the brown, the Indian, the sick, the weak, the illiterate, the retarded, the criminal, the psychotic, after such a barrage of pleas and threats, of saccharine and blood, that one could be tempted in protest to hate babies and kittens, the altruists have suddenly shut up before an unprecedented atrocity of historic scale. The murder of a city, the evacuation of Phnom Penh, a horde of savages that would make Attila look civilized by comparison, has given the world a perfect concretization of three abstractions which civilized men have taken with too foggy a tolerance. Collectivism, which regards individual lives as of no value, the rule of force, which implements the whims of the subhuman. Ecology as a social principle, which condemns cities, culture, industry, technology, the intellect, and advocates men's return to nature, to the state of grunting sub-animals digging the soil with their bare hands. Since the Khmer Rouge are peasants who feel hatred for cities, the inhabitants of Phnom Penh, its entire population without exceptions, were ordered to march out of the city and to go on marching until they reached uninhabited countryside, where they were to start farming on their own, without knowledge, tools, or seed. This order applied to everyone, young and old, rich and poor, men, women, and children, the well and the ill, even the crippled and, according to a news report, even the hospital patients who had just had their legs amputated. Everyone was ordered to walk. They walked. This is all we know. There have been no further reports on the fate of that evacuation. After a few shocked remarks, there were no protests from our media or from those liberal altruists who cry over the victims of relative poverty in America. The liberals had been minimizing or ridiculing the conservatives' fear that a bloodbath would follow a communist victory. If human suffering concerned them at all, one would expect the altruists to scream their heads off against an atrocity which is worse than a bloodbath, a mass execution by long drawn-out torture. But the altruists have shut their traps. So have the altruists of Europe. There has been no significant protest from the hundreds of world organizations devoted to the relief of suffering, including that contemptible citadel of global hypocrisy, the UN. The best commentary on Phnom Penh, of those I have read, was Get Out of Town by William Safire, a conservative, the New York Times, May 12, 1975. In all human history, nothing has taken place quite like the emptying of Phnom Penh. Sennacherib destroyed Babylon, the Romans sacked Carthage, and Hitler's bombers leveled Guernica. But in every case, the attacker was destroying a particular city, not the idea of a city itself. A city is civilization. Civilization is diversity and creativity, which needs personal freedom. Communism is by its nature anti-city, anti-civilization, anti-freedom. The Khmer Rouge understand this. Too many Americans do not. To go from the horrendous to the grotesque, consider the Mayaguez incident. I hasten to say that were it not for the proper and highly moral action taken by President Ford, the consequences of that incident could have been more horrendous than Phnom Penh. That a small band of those same Cambodian savages dared seize an unarmed American ship was such an affront to America and to civilization that the collapse of international law would have followed if President Ford had not acted as he did. President Ford used air, sea, and ground forces to free the ship. To borrow Senator Goldwater's very appropriate phrase, every half-assed nation would have felt free to attack the U.S., which would have meant world rule by terrorist gangs. We shall never know whether the seizure of the Mayaguez was a deliberate provocation to test what the global communist scum could get away with, or the spontaneous feat of a local gang drunk with power and acting more royalist than their kings. But this does not concern us in either case when a foreign country initiates the use of armed force against us. It is our moral obligation to answer by force as promptly and unequivocally as is necessary to make it clear that the matter is non-negotiable. Believe it or not, some American intellectuals and some politicians objected to President Ford's action. Mr. Anthony Lewis went so far as to declare it was America, but was a bully among nations acting without consultation, without concern for fact or principle. The Times, May 19, 1975. His principal and filthy accusations rest on the fact that we allowed less than a day and a half for a response from the untried and isolated government of a shattered country. After which he struggles to prove that part of the U.S. bombing of a Cambodian airport could only have been punitive in purpose. I hope so. It's international altruism gone wild. It demands that the U.S. give up self-defense in order to make allowances for an untried government. This means, I suppose, that we should wait until that government has gained experience in attacking us. If those Cambodian brutes were so ignorant as to permit themselves an attack on a U.S. ship, the more reason to use force in answer, in order to teach them caution in the future. force is the only language that totalitarian brutes understand. An interesting appraisal of the Mayagas incident was given by C.L. Sulzberger, a liberal, who hailed President Ford's action in a column entitled "Just What the Doctor Ordered." Times, May 17, 1975. Since Mr. Sulzberger's columns deal mainly with the reactions of other countries to U.S. foreign policy, his enthusiasm in this instance is significant, revealing, and almost pathetic. It shows the extent of the dismal, gray hopelessness previously conveyed by our international diplomacy. Small as the incident may later seem in history, a polluting stain is being erased from the previous American image of lassitude, uncertainty, and pessimism. This is a matter of world ideological concern, as well as strategic balances, because too many democracies are sick. Now a new vibrancy creeps into the picture. Mr. Sulzberger explains, the internationally renowned American tempo and productivity still lag, and the work ethic, with its emphasis on speed and efficiency, whether prompted by Puritanism or by the capitalistic profit, motive has certainly undergone visible and withering change. In this uncertain age, American flabbiness is harmful to the United States. In the absence of American leadership, Mr. Sulzberger concludes, many Western countries were left adrift. Now Gerald Ford seems to have put an end to that sad phase. Abruptly, he has shown Americans and the world that he knows how to get where he wishes to go. Hopefully, he also possesses a good sense of direction. Nobody respects an altruist, neither in private life nor in international affairs. An altruist is a person who keeps sacrificing himself and his values, which means sacrificing his friends to his enemies, his allies to his antagonists, his interest to any cry for help, his strength to anyone's weakness, his convictions to anyone's wishes, the truth to any lie, the good to any evil. How would you tell an altruist's treacherously unpredictable policy from that of a cowardly Miktos? And what difference would it make to his victims? A man practicing such a policy would be mistrusted and despised by everyone, including the profiteers on his generosity. As close to practicing as any nation ever could. And if foreign countries are now cheering the sight of a giant, the U.S. standing up to a flea, Cambodia, it is the momentary defeat of altruism that they are cheering unknowingly. It is America's liberation from altruism's flabbiness. It is America's declaration to all the fleas of the world that the world is not to perish as a meal for fleas. The American people's reaction to the Mayagas incident was a great and tragic demonstration of America's sense of life. Great, because when the news broke out, the letters and wires received at the White House ran 10-1 in support of President Ford's intention to use military force against Cambodia. The American people, battered by disillusionment over a senseless war and by vicious pro-enemy anti-war propaganda, could have had an excuse to fear and oppose the potential risk of another war in the same geographical area. But they did not. They understood the principle involved. They were willing to fight, but not to accept an affront, which incidentally is the only way to avoid a war, but not many leaders said so. This grasp of principles when the chips are down, this proudly rebellious independence in the face of lies and threats, is what defeats the calculations of the manipulators, foreign or domestic. Attempt to con the American people. The tragedy lies in the fact that these American characteristics can come into play only when the chips are down. A sense of life cannot foresee or prevent a catastrophe. It cannot save people from moving toward a disaster by single gradual steps. Foresight and prevention are the task of conscious thought and knowledge, i.e., of political philosophy. In regard to a nation, they are the task of the intellectuals. Just as Russia collapsed through the philosophical bankruptcy of its anti-communists, so did China, so did every rebellion against communist rule. in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland. So that does. Will every attempt to hold out a mixed economy and or socialism as an alternative to communism worth fighting and dying for. The greatest intellectual crime today is that of the alleged rightists in this country, with recent reality. And potentially an overwhelming majority of the American people on their side, they are afraid to assume the responsibility of a moral crusade for America's values, for capitalism with everything. This necessitates observe the extent to which the tear gas of altruism is making them squirm. But unless men are brave enough to ventilate this country's moral atmosphere, they have no chance. For a nation, as for a man, a declaration of independence implies a declaration of self-esteem. Neither can stand without the other. Much as I admire President Ford's conduct in the Mayaguez incident, there are many aspects of his policies with which I do not agree. Valid one here is his appeal to leave Vietnam behind us and to avoid recriminations over that war. The lessons of Vietnam, he claims, have been learned. Have they? What? And who got us into that war? Why? For what reason and purpose? How did a war advocated and begun by the liberals, mainly by Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, become the conservatives' war? Isn't a moral obscenity such as a no-win war unconstitutional, as a violation of the soldiers' right to life, since it turned soldiers into cannon fodder? These are just a few of the questions to which the country has no clear answers. The Vietnam War is one of the most disastrous foreign policy failures in U.S. history. We spent 2 years investigating everything connected with 7 burglars sent by a bunch of politicians to bug the headquarters of another bunch of politicians. What is that compared to the enormity of Vietnam? We kept hearing, and are still steering, that Watergate represented a threat to our rights, our freedom, our social system, and our Constitution. What was Vietnam? Shouldn't there be an investigation of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam wider, deeper, and more thorough than the investigation of Watergate, with nationally televised congressional hearings? Dozens of famous witnesses, with daily headlines, editorials, debates, etc. A purpose to discover the causes in order to avoid the recurrence or the continuation of the policies that led to Vietnam. Such an investigation would not be likely to uncover any crimes other than intellectual ones, but try to imagine the magnitude of those. Intellectual crimes cannot and need not be punished by law. The only punishment required is exposure. But who would conduct such an inquiry? Who would be able to ask the right questions and integrate the answers and point out the contradictions and hammer at the evasions and bring out the fundamental issues? Obviously, this is not a task for politicians. It is a task for theoretical thinkers, for intellectuals, for philosophers. But today, they are the men who were responsible for the kind of thinking that was responsible for our involvement in Vietnam. This is the reason why no such investigation can or will be held today. And this is the all-inclusive lesson to be learned from Vietnam.